Okay, welcome aboard. Charles Moskowitz here. Welcome to the program. Ari Perlinger is my guest today. He's an author of various books, including American Zealots, Inside Right Wing Domestic Terrorism. He is a professor at UMass Lowell. He's a criminologist. Ari, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is a serious subject, of course. We're talking about a potential increase in domestic terrorism in the United States and what to watch for, who's involved, what are their motivations, what is their ideology. So let's go right to your thesis and talk a bit about what makes up a terrorist and where are we as a society today in terms of the level of potential terrorism.
Yeah, so I think when we are talking about domestic terrorism, usually we are referring to acts of violence that are aimed to promote specific policies, specific political objectives that are aiming to push forward specific social norms, social practices, and so on. So in general, terrorism is a political action, is using violence to promote political objectives. In most cases, terrorism is trying to instill fear, anxiety, hysteria within a specific community in order to put pressure on the leaders of that community or the community itself to concede to the demands of those terrorists. So terrorism is basically a psychological warfare or a kind of psychological warfare where violence is being utilized in order to promote political objectives.
Mhm.
Uh, and terrorism is not exclusive to any specific political stream. We've seen throughout American history, we've seen domestic terrorism coming from the right, from the left, from single issue groups. So there's no, I guess, political domain which didn't experimented with terrorism in the American context.
So it seems like you're talking about state-sponsored terrorism at some level or institutionally sponsored as a way to weaken, to attack, to degrade a society by creating such horrifying acts that it requires that people react by wanting to have someone come in like a white knight to save the day and restore order. It is a complete undoing of social order. In the Bible, they talk about Amalek as being such a force because he attacked the rear guard of the Israelite caravan, where women and children and the weak and the elderly were. And it was such an abominable act and such a cowardly act that they were condemned forever. And that it seems to me that that's what the terrorist does, whether it be an individual or whether it be a coordinated, planned activity by a state, that they want to weaken a society. They want to create such mayhem in a society that that society becomes destabilized and in a way set up for a change that they then try to affect.
Yes, I think I want to emphasize terrorism can be a tool that is being used by state actors, and we are familiar with many state actors who are using terrorism to promote their objectives, their policies. Iran, for example, is known for operating a network of proxies operating all over the world in order to promote Iranian interests,
Right.
whether it's Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen or Shia groups in Iraq. They are basically are employing these networks of proxies that are using terrorist tactics to promote Iranian objectives. But especially when we're talking about the American case, about domestic terrorism, for the most part, we're talking about groups that are not state sponsored, usually are not really associated with the states. If you're talking about terrorism from the right, we can talk about the traditional white supremacist groups such as the KKK and various neo-Nazi groups and skinheads and so on and so forth. We can talk from the we can talk about environmental terrorism. That means environmental activists who are using violence in order to promote awareness to their cause, but also in order to basically put pressure on the government to promote environmental policies. We can also talk about the left, especially in the 60s and the 70s, but also in other times we've seen various left-wing groups operating in the US in order to promote Marxist, Leninist, various left-wing ideas and using violence. Probably one of the most famous terrorist groups that ever operated in the US, the Weathermen, basically, were a classic left-wing groups, mainly consisted of students who, again, believed that they should promote an actual revolution in the
Right.
US in order to change the political system.
Right. And the way they did it was they bombed the US Capitol building.
They bombed
And knocked them on
FBI
the-
offices. They bombed, military recruitment offices. Yeah, they were basically, they literally declared war on the U.S. government because they believe that the U.S. government is corrupt, is promote destructive policies, and also because they believe that there's a need to push to more left-wing socialist, I would even say a little bit Marxist policies.
A little bit, I'd say complete out of
Yeah.
communism. Ari, but your work seems to emphasize what you call right-wing terrorism. And I think that that's obviously there. It's always been there. You still have the Ku Klux Klan, although back in the 19th century, they had a lot of influence. It was sort of the terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. And then under Wilson, they made a sort of a resurgence in the North. But I think they were largely undone by very good work by various FBI agents who infiltrated them and kind of undid them in the 1960s in the same way that they undid the Black Panthers in the 1970s with Operation COINTELPRO. And I think that, the right-wing terrorists, I mean, they're always going to be there. They are there, but that's not really the main thrust of potential terrorism, I don't think, in America today. I think it's on the left. And I would point to the reaction of the genocidal attack on Israel on October 6th, the so-called Al-Aqsa flood, was an emergence of these left-wing groups and their kind of not to be derogatory, but their lapdogs on college campuses, but also some of their leadership who attacked the state of Israel in response. And I recall Alan Dershowitz, I thought, kind of capsulized the situation when he said that these protests may seem like just innocent expressions of free speech today on campuses, but they are breeding grounds for future actions that may reverberate in an unpleasant way in terms of terrorism than the type of terrorism that Israel's had to deal with forever, and that is more common in countries that have been radicalized. Would you comment on that?
So yeah, sure. So first of all, I think it's important to emphasize that I'm a scientist, so I look at the data, and the data is what guides me. And I'll talk in a sec about October 7th and the implication of October 7th. But the data is still very clear. The highest level of violence is still coming from the right, not from the KKK. The KKK today is a marginal.
That's what I mean.
A marginal group with very limited followers, most of them people very elderly. The threat is coming from new variations of neo-Nazi organizations, of anti-government organizations who really promote new variations of far-right ideologies that are focusing on promoting societal collapse, that seeing the federal government as their major threat, but more importantly, they are actually engaged in efforts to produce violent attacks, and also they produce hundreds of violent attacks. So that's one thing. Secondly, October 7th, I think, or what happened after October 7th, I think reflect several trends which are very concerning. And I'm saying that as someone who actually published about the recent trends of anti-Semitism in the US.
Mm-hmm.
First is what I want to emphasize is the fact that anti-Semitism today, especially acts of violence, are coming from the left even more than what we see from the right, at least in the last 18 months. That's
Right.
what the data shows us.
Right.
And
Right.
we definitely see this is not a new thing. In 2021, when there was an escalation in Gaza, we've seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents. So we've seen that almost every time when there's an escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's increase in anti-Semitic incidents here in the US. Now, I think there are several things that are really concerning about what we've seen after October 7th. The first is that I reject the argument that what we see is a response to Israel's military intervention in Gaza, for the very simple fact that the protests, including the targeting of Jews, began on October 8th, way before Israel started to operate in Gaza.
Oh, it happened even before while they were still attacking. I mean,
Yeah, the attack was still, and something, by the way, that was not just restricted to extremist movement. It was something that you've seen on university quads. You've seen that on social media when people who are consider themselves my colleagues were openly celebrating, legitimizing, tolerating what happened on October 7th. People, academics who were talk very highly about inclusiveness, about human rights, about all those things we're openly celebrating. I think that was a shock for me, as well as to many other people in academia who felt that this is something. But so that's just one point. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the fact that almost systematically, those groups do not target Israelis, they target Jewish institutions. They target Jewish schools, Hillel, Jewish Hillel organizations, Jewish restaurants, Jewish events, synagogues, and so on. If it's about Israel policies, how anyone can explain the fact that the major targets of those protest movements are actually Jewish targets, not Israeli targets?
That's right.
And the last thing I'm going to say is the fact that many of those groups did not just celebrate what happened on October 7th, but continue to basically convey the messages of violent organization, including Hamas, a designated terrorist organization. For all of those reasons, I think those are concerning trends. And I think that the efforts to legitimize those trends, to legitimize those kind of... I have no issues with someone who is criticizing Israel policies. That's
Right. Of course, that's not the issue.
the problem is that the targets of those movements were consistently Jewish targets, not Israeli targets.
Right. And I want to just drill down a little bit on that because I wasn't surprised. I've been observing this for a long time. And I think that a lot of my very liberal friends were surprised. But, it's not really, I mean, I come at it from a different angle. But I want to just drill down exactly what's going on there, how that happened. I think that the groups like the proxies of Iran and Hamas and all the rest, these are very well-heeled organizations that have learned how to play the right propaganda card for left-wingers around the world to bring them into their camp. And the card that they play is anti-American, America, it's unfair, it exploited people. The theory of exploitation, which is actually a cornerstone of Marxism, that somehow if you have something more than your neighbor, it's because you rip them off, and that therefore you feel entitled to take it from them. That there you have that element that, and also there's the Jewish element in the religious sense. Israel's a Jewish state. I mean, they believe in God. I mean, they don't believe in, a world of, an ant colony where everything is fair. It's more of a concept of sovereignty, of Americanism, of capitalism, the startup nation. All of these grievances were exploited, I think, by the mullahs and by the radical Islamists to make a kind of an intersectionality with the international left. And that I think that really became obvious and manifested after October 7th.
So I think what we see is basically intellectual and sorry for using academic lingo, intellectual reductionism
Hmm.
by a lot of people who are considered themselves as liberals, uh, uh, as people who are at the left or the center left. I think the major problem, I think, is the inability to understand complexities, the inability to understand nuance, and the fact that large parts of our political left basically adopted a very simplistic, rigid, binary perspective on political issues. So they cannot really comprehend that that American Jews can be actual minority group, that can be a minority group who is vulnerable, that needs to be protected, and so on and so forth. Because in their own rigid binary perspectives, right, where the world is divided strictly to oppressors and oppressed, there's no place for complexities, there's no place for nuance, there's no place for understanding that even what we call modern minorities, like American Jews, can be in under some conditions, they can also be a very vulnerable minority. Now, what happened is that, so that's one element. The second element, of course, is the fact that while there's extreme sensitivity to the action of the Israeli government, Israeli policies, and so on and so forth, there are complete unwillingness to address, to acknowledge, to comprehend with the actions of those who are considered oppressed. Even the oppressed can engage in war crimes, in inhumane policies and behaviors, but the idea is that if you're oppressed, you basically get a carte blanche to do everything. Everything is justified, everything is accepted, everything is tolerated. And the fact is that the left is not able to understand that even people who are oppressed can be engage in illegitimate actions. And so this is how we get to the point where their complete unwillingness to acknowledge, to accept the atrocities that were conducted on October 7th, and on the other end, there's this kind of insistence to delegitimize any kind of Israel's policies.
Well, I
And
think it's
also,
important.
one thing, Charles, just for one thing I want to say is also the idea that those so-called oppressed have no agency. They are not responsible for their situation. Their situation is completely beyond their control, which is not the case. Which is not the case. And I would just urge you to, if you're actually looking at what's going on in Gaza, it's very clear that there is substantial support for Hamas actions. And I think that on some level, the Palestinians also need to take ownership and responsibility on their own situation.
I think that that's going to be very difficult for them because of their leadership, and also that they've embraced and imbibed some of this same propaganda that the left on campus has embraced. And it has nothing to do with someone's minority status. I don't think they care about that. I think it's more the fact that the Jewish people generally are viewed as more successful, more educated. They have more family values. They believe in a God rather than believing in the state. That they're individualistic. They're kind of more out there. It's always created resentment, and I think that as such, the Jews have stood as obstacles to their idea of perfect equality. Everyone has to be absolute equal. We have to have a one world ant colony, and that somehow they resent the fact that the Jew is obviously we're not talking about individuals here. We're talking in general. That it's seen as somewhat a little bit outside of this sort of conformist world. I mean, it's a bit different, and somebody who's a little bit more self-actualized and more self-identified. And so you have these kinds of resentments that then are exploited by powerful people and state players who then are able to marshal people who are otherwise unwitting and otherwise kind of, they want to be trendy. I mean, I know people like this, including Jewish friends and even people in my own family, putting on a keffiyeh, they think it's like trendy. They think that it's going to be and getting them invited to the good parties. They'll have better dates. I don't know. This. I think you get that. And that there's a kind of a mass. There's a word in sociology for this, like a kind of an effervescent phenomena where people just sort of go into something without really understanding it. When they're out chanting "River to the Sea," they don't know what that even means. They don't even know what river they're talking about. They don't know they're calling for the annihilation of the Jewish state. And if they did, they probably wouldn't support it. But they are into it because it's fashionable, because they want to be one of the beautiful people. They want to be part of
Yeah,
this.
I'm less forgiving. I think that what especially,
I don't forgive it at all.
I met with a lot of students who define themselves as anti-Zionist Jews. Now, I I believe that everybody have the right to espouse his own views and beliefs and political views. That's perfectly fine. I
Right.
just find it curious that they believe that the only polity or the only people who should not have the right for self-determination are the Jewish people. I find that curious, especially
It's
from their own. Also, I would just mention the fact that the state of Israel is already exists. And for all practicalities, it doesn't go anywhere. So to hold a position that you believe that there's one state out of the 200 and something states in the world, there's one state that needs to be dismantled, it's just the Jewish state. I find that especially curious and a unique form of anti-Semitism, to be honest. Excluding the Jewish state and believing that there's one group of people who are uniquely do not deserve self-determination, I do think it's a form of anti-Semitism. I think that if you have a general view that nation states should be dismantled, that's something else. But if you believe that there's just one state that should be dismantled, and coincidentally, that state is exactly the Jewish state, I think that's something else. And I think that the fact that this is something that is being legitimized, I think it's interesting. I would also say the fact that despite the fact that many different countries are perpetrating atrocities, I would even say probably more atrocities than the state of Israel, the unique focus and the unique willingness to delegitimizing, to demonizing, to undermine the right of the state of Israel to exist and defend itself. Again, I find it very curious. I haven't seen anyone going to the street to demonstrate about 1.5 million Uyghurs that are being held in concentration camp in China, or about the several millions of Syrians that were killed in the Syrian civil war, or any other of those atrocities. The unique willingness to demonizing the Jewish state, I find it very curious and something which sometimes it's difficult to explain unless you are willing to admit that this is a form of Jewish hate.
Well, they don't really care about atrocity. It has more to do with using the atrocity propaganda against one group and not another. I mean, they never complained about the Soviet Union or, as you say, communist China. That's not a problem. It has more to do with a situational rather than a fundamental opposition to atrocity, whereas you and I and most conventional people, we reject atrocity across the board because it's evil and because it's wrong. So that, I think, is the mentality. And as far as their opposition to that one state, I actually think that they are opposed to all sovereign states. They don't like American sovereignty either. That's why they support things like open borders. They want to have this kind of turn all nations into this new kind of provinces of the world. I don't know whatever it is. They all have different weird utopian understandings of it. But getting back to your thesis here, American zealots inside right-wing domestic terrorism. Again, none of these people that we're talking about here are right-wing. They're actually left-wing. But your focus is on right-wingers. And I think that, yes, of course, they're out there, but it needs a little updating because I don't want to see, this used as a bludgeon against, for example, President Trump, right? Because, there's like a guilt by association. Oh, they're right wing, they're going to be involved with violence when they're not. So I'm concerned about that particular aspect of your focus.
Yeah. So my book, by the way, my book was published in 2020. So
Oh,
so there is some kind of delay. I would also say most of the research was conducted between 2012, 2013, and 2018. So there is, as every book, it takes some time to digest until. So the situation, of course, change over time. What I would say is very simple. There are in every political camp, in every ideological camp, there a spectrum of political groups, political organizations. My research for the last 20 something years focusing on violent political organizations, groups that are using violence to promote their objectives. So when I'm talking about the far right in my book, I'm talking about violent neo-Nazis, violent skinheads, violent Christian identity groups, violent anti-abortionists, and so on and so forth. The book is not focusing. For example, you won't find in the book even one word about the Tea Party, the movement, because
right.
that was not a violent movement. It was a political movement, regardless of what you think about its objective. It has. So I'm not.
Okay.
I do not think that conservatives or Republicans should see the book as some kind of efforts to undermine their
Well,
views.
I'm not
What I'm
worried about
focusing is understanding the history of those groups and understanding the current trends and processes that leads those groups to use violence. And that's my focus. The same way, by the way, that, in 2009, when I published my book about Jewish terrorism in Israel, I focused on a very specific set of groups. And naturally, I'm myself a Jewish person, so I'm not arguing that Judaism, for some reason, is an extremist religion. I'm arguing that in every religious tradition, in every political camp, for the most part, you find some groups who are on the extremes, on the margins, on the fringe, who are willing to use violence. And I'm trying to understand what leads those groups to use violence.
No, I mean, and I agree with that. I mean, you find extreme on the fringe. My concern isn't that Republicans or Tea Party people are going to take it that way. My concern is that the sort of the liberal left leaning establishment may use it in that way. I mean, because you've got shelves of books and theories and professors talking about Donald Trump as Hitler and that the MAGA movement, they're all Nazis. I mean, even recently, Timothy Snyder over at Yale, an article, Trump was anti-Semitic because, it's almost like it reminds me of the QAnon craziness. They moved his finger this way, not that way. Therefore, he doesn't like Jews. I mean, it's
So
insane.
I
Meanwhile,
think
he's rubbing shoulders with professors at Yale who are calling for the destruction of Israel, which by nature would, I would argue, lead to a second Holocaust.
so. That's the problem is that many people, many academics do not do science anymore. What they do is political activism.
Yes.
Many academics basically transitioned to political activism, to
Immediately.
political work, and they don't do science anymore. And I'm someone who was very open to my colleagues, to my university leadership, to in many different forums. I expressed my concerns about the politizations of academia, and especially the fact that many entire disciplines within the academic domain were basically transformed from science to hubs, enclaves of political activism. Now, how do I know that? Because they will never hire someone who do not conform to their very rigid ideological platform. So you have an entire departments in academia with people which have a very uniform set of views and beliefs. And I think that this is exactly the opposite of what academia should be. Academia is about challenging, it's about debating, it's about providing different perspectives. But first, first, it's about actually basing your views on actual research and actual data, and that's what I do. I agree with you that way too many parts of academia are completely abandoned what they need to do into political activism. And this is why people do not trust academia anymore. This is why people do not trust the academic institutions anymore, because what they see as are basically just political hubs, and people like Timothy Snyder's and others, yes, they can say whatever they want, but uh, but they really just the symptoms of a much deeper problem, which I've witnessed in the last 10, 15 years, where more and more people are basically exploiting their academic position just to engage in political work. If you want to be a politician, go and get elected.
But yeah, but the issue is broader than that, in that they have taken the high ground of the culture. They've taken the high ground of the mainstream media. I'll give you an example. Lester Holt was at an award ceremony where he said, objective journalism is a thing of the past. That's outdated. We have to advocate. And that's what they do in various levels. And they are very much in sync with these professors and heads of major institutions. And it's become very pervasive. That's what I'm suggesting here. And that pervasiveness not only has led to a lack of confidence in the media, and I think that the election of Trump is just a symptom of it, that the American people are rejecting it, but it also leads to potential violence. It basically incites potential terrorism, is my concern. And that's what the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, because I do think that this kind of general language that's used and this general attempt to monopolize the conversation is a recipe for such violence.
Yeah, I think I agree with you that I think the political polarization and the tendency to present the political process as some kind of a zero-sum game, I think push people to more radical views and potentially to radical actions. And I think that we've seen that throughout American history. And definitely I agree with you that demonizing your political rivals, your political adversaries, and
Right.
and presenting them as illegitimate, as unacceptable, and most importantly as some kind of an existential threat, eventually intensify this kind of political polarization, and eventually doesn't really promote any constructive policies. And I think that you see that, by the way, on both sides of the political spectrum. But I do think, so that I will argue, many of my colleagues tend to see that just from one side. They believe that the right is the one who. I actually think that both sides should be blamed for demonizing and to really transforming our political discourse into some kind of a zero-sum game where there's no center anymore. And by the way, this is why centrists are leaving Congress, right? You see that you look at the last 5, 6 years, almost all the senators and congressmen who are retiring are people from the center who basically understand that there's no way to actually promote policies anymore, because both parties are really running into the margins. And I think that I completely agree with you. And I think that language and discourse has a huge impact on the way people think. And definitely, we've seen that in the last few years when we've seen mass violent protests, both on the left and the right, right? And I was one of those who argued that yes, we cannot accept violent protests from either side. We should not, and definitely significant parts of academic circles and media circles felt comfortable to ignore violence when it's coming from the left, uh, which again reflect biases that exist. I think that people like me who are really doing the research, our responsibility is to stick to the facts. I think I can't hear you for some reason.
Okay, can you hear me now, Ari? Okay,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a little technical glitch. I think that maybe people are too caught up in confirmation bias that goes beyond um, the point where you end up creating a false agenda, and that you have a hypothesis that you look to issues that are going to prove that hypothesis, and therefore you glean stuff that supports that agenda and ignore and winnow out stuff that doesn't, and that's what leads to extremism. And I think that we see that, yeah, you're right, it is on both sides. The problem is that today I think that the left dominates the field. If it was the right dominating the field, we would probably have the same criticism. But so Ari, talk about. My guest is Ari Perlinger. He is the author of American Zealots. He's a professor here at UMass Lowell. Inside Right Wing Domestic Terrorism, which is available at Amazon and other venues. What are you working on now, Ari?
So I'm working on multiple projects, one of them focusing on extremism within police organizations and within the military. These are projects that are actually funded by the government
Okay,
through grants from DHS and DoD. They're trying to understand how they can protect soldiers, police officers from being drawn into those extremist movements.
good.
Uh, Another very big project, and that's actually my next book that I'm hoping will be out by spring 2026, focusing on violent extremist misogyny. I'm focusing on a, a
Violence against
mis-
women. Right.
yes,
Okay.
violence against, but I'm talking about ideological violence against women. So I'm talking about groups that are operating and promoting misogynist narratives, focusing uh, on various aspects of misogyny and various aspects of violence. And I'm also focusing on female dominant spaces to promote misogyny. So it's a very interesting project. We collected a lot of data,
Boy.
and this is something that I think will be very interesting. I think there's many people underestimate how popular and how significantly those spaces and groups are growing in the last few years. And
Hmm.
uh, and this is the book that I'm working on right now, and it will be out very soon.
Excellent. That's going to be a real hot potato. That's excellent. Ari, do you want to mention any websites that you'd like my listeners to go to find out more about you and your work?
I'm a boring academic guy, so they are welcome to go to Amazon author centers, and they can find my books there. And they can also approach me directly if they want to get more information or to get to know more about the interesting things we're doing.
Okay, excellent. Ari Perliger, I want to thank you for joining me today. Excellent talk. I really appreciate it. Let's stay in touch. Maybe keep me posted on your new book and we can do more of it. So thanks so much.